We're seeing a change in our society, have seen it over recent times, where we deal with a lot of lies and we have to sort through and find out what's the truth. And you can talk to different folks, and all of a sudden they'll say something. You say, well, no, that's not right. Um, and then you have to sift through and say, well, are they right? Am I right? And it gets down to how do you find the truth? And unfortunately, the media today doesn't necessarily share the truth. Um, and an underlying principle of socialism, which you'll see, is that a free press and the truth is the enemy. So socialism itself is linked to lying. Now, the past several weeks, we've been discussing socialism in the Bible, not Christian socialism per se. In fact, socialism is not Christian. That's really kind of an oxymoron. But we've spoken about various flavors: Marxism, National Socialism, fascism, democratic socialism. You may recall that Mussolini was a socialist. Hitler was a socialist, National Socialist. All share a methodology that depends on deception and intentional prevarication, which is a $10 word, actually maybe a $50 word for lying. We will be discussing this today a bit. Remember, Jesus stood before Pilate, and Pilate asked, "What is truth?" Because Pilate knew truth was elusive, and it was hard for him as a leader, I am quite certain, to find out the truth. Truth can definitely be elusive. Now, truth, that's an apple pie in the background. Um, you know, telling the truth used to be as American as mom and apple pie. And I can tell you, traveling around the world, what I found was in most cultures, truth, absolute truth, and not telling a lie is not necessarily a virtue. As a matter of fact, lying and taking advantage of somebody else in some cultures is virtuous. That's acclaimed by others. When I was growing up, and I suspect most people on this call the same way, every school kid was taught the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, the little boy who would not tell a lie. Every child also learned the Ten Commandments in school. Well, that's all changed. It's almost impossible nowadays, especially if you are watching the news, to be certain if anyone is telling the truth. Change the channel and you'll get the direct opposite. I recall when I was on the board down at Disney, the former Reedy Creek Investment District board, that I shared something one day, and it was quoted in the papers and also on some of the television stations. And what was interesting was the Orlando Sentinel and CNN. I didn't check all of the stations, but I checked some. But those two reported the exact opposite of what I had said. The exact opposite. They changed my words. Lying, unfortunately, is too common, and things have changed. Uh, a, a, a couple lying with the megaphone of social media or tied together, lying with the megaphone of social media and the news, and you have a volatile combination. That's lying on steroids. Things go viral, lies go viral. I think it was Mark Twain who says, a lie travels around the world while the truth is still putting its shoes on, or something similar. But you get the idea. Lies travel fast. The ninth commandment used to be part of every American child's training, and it shaped our culture. A man's word was his bond. Integrity was absolutely critical. Those times have changed pretty substantially. The ninth commandment, a lot of people are confused about what it actually says. It doesn't actually say, thou shalt not lie. That's what people think it says. But what it actually says is this, and I put two translations up there. In the King James, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And the NIV, You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. In other words, it most particularly has to do with speaking about somebody else and saying that they did something or didn't do something, and it's a lie. And why would somebody do that? Well, either to impugn another person or to make another person look better than they are. Um, and recall that the Ten Commandments were given not as a means of salvation, but as a way to form a society. And if in a society, people come and they testify against others in court or elsewhere, and they lie, then the society itself begins to break down. God does not lie. It's impossible for God to tell a lie, we're told in Titus 1:8. It's a trick question, almost a trick question, when you ask people, well, what is it that God can't do? There is something he can't possibly do. Well, that's what it is, because every word from his mouth is truth. When Jesus spoke, he spoke the truth. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. And then he would start when he would speak and say, truly, truly, I say to you, or verily, verily, I say to you in the King James, meaning, I am saying this, and therefore it is true. Now, the prophets never said, truly, truly, I tell you. Truly, truly, I say to you. Verily, verily, I tell you. They would say, thus saith the Lord. In other words, they were speaking on behalf of God. The truth came from God. Jesus, because he was God, when he spoke, whatever he said was true. Truth is communicated through words, but it's also communicated through pictures, through videos, and so on. And we live in an age when the means of doing that has been changed forever by technology. You speak to your phone and you say, hey, Siri, how old is Joe Namath? And it comes back and it says he's 72 years old. Well, that's incorrect. Okay, he's significantly older than that. But if Siri says it, people will believe it. Now with artificial intelligence, with ChatGPT and Grok and others, it's gotten much worse because you can get a mix of lies with the truth. And then you go back and you have to double check to make sure that what you just got was correct. Now, typically, Siri tells me something, I tend to believe what it has to say. ChatGPT, Grok, I tend to believe, but it's not always true. And now I notice there are warnings. I just saw it last night in ChatGPT. The ChatGPT sometimes makes mistakes. Okay, so they're not calling it a lie, they're calling it a mistake. The means of communication have changed. Until not long ago, the pen was mightier than the sword. But back in 2020, Warren Buffett sold his last newspaper holding. Why did he sell it? Because the press does not have the same influence it once did, the written press. Today, social media is mightier than the sword. Somebody sees something on TikTok or Facebook or whatever, and it becomes the news, even though it's not the news. And so we have influencers who don't necessarily tell the truth, but they influence, and they have millions of followers in some cases. So who can be certain that what they read, see, or hear is the truth, whether it's on social media, on TV, in the paper, or in an email? Just as God is the source of truth, Satan is the father of lies. This is his world. Jesus said to the hypocrites, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, and there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Okay, so now you begin to get the picture that there are those who are followers of Jesus who should be drawn to the truth and who should be telling the truth. And those who reject him and embrace a more selfish approach to life, lies become a much easier thing to tell. And with Satan, lies are the norm. Now, we live in a time of lies and false witnesses. We watched court cases and we watched congressional hearings where people came and said the most fantastic things, totally opposite to the character of the individuals who were sitting there. And quite typically, it would be just one person speaking about a particular situation, and then another person would talk about another situation. Oh, yes, I saw that person do that somewhere else. Well, that is not corroboration. Um, that corroboration is when you have two people at exactly the same place at exactly the same time who observe the same thing and give the same report. Now, we live in a time of lies and false witnesses. Um, Duck soup. Chico Marx, he's the one on the left there. Your ears and eyes can lie to you. Chico Marx in the movie Duck Soup said, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? Okay, so now that's your trivia for the day. Now you know where that quote comes from. Photoshop pictures, deep fakes, made up stories, now AI videos. There was just a major figure in the past day or two who said, somebody in Congress who said, no, I didn't say that. That was an artificial intelligence creation. That was an AI video of me. That wasn't me speaking. But it doesn't have to be that elaborate or even high tech. It can just be what's included and what is omitted in what you're told on the news, or a different picture added to a voiceover. And so you'll notice this technique that happens all the time, where you'll see somebody speaking. It might be the president, and then you don't hear him speaking. The announcer, the newscaster, will tell you what he said. And at a later date, you think that's what he said. He may never have said that at all, but you were told that's what he said, and you have the picture in your mind. And so it's a technique of journalism, so-called journalism, that tricks you into thinking that somebody did something or said something that they never said or did. Sometimes they'll take and splice together several segments of the same speech. And you wind up with someone saying the exact opposite because the key words have been removed that would explain and show and demonstrate what that person actually said. Now, the dawn of fake news. So we can go back quite a few decades. When I was in high school, uh, we had fake news. It wasn't called that back then. I first ran into it in Madison, New Jersey, where I grew up, with the barbershop riots. Well, there weren't riots, but they called them that. There were half a dozen uh, college kids from Drew University who were picketing on the sidewalk in front of a barbershop. Now, we got out of school at the end of the day, and at the end of our classes, we walked a mile or so downtown because we had heard there was something going on downtown. And what we saw was these kids with these pickets walking in a very orderly fashion in circles in front of this barbershop. And across the street, there were well over 100 people behind the police barricades. And then we saw the cameras from CBS and NBC, and at that point Dumont Television, and there was, I think, another station that was there taking the pictures. And that night on the news, we rushed to watch Walter Cronkite and Douglas Edwards and so on um, to see. And it was most interesting because each of the networks showed the picketers, but then they showed the crowds not as onlookers, but as protesters. Okay, so instead of a half a dozen people protesting, it made it appear as if there were well over 100 people who were protesting. We all saw Dan Rather broadcasting an explosive report on the Air National Guard Service of President George W. Bush. It was supposed to be the high point of Rather's career, like Woodward and Bernstein with Nixon. Instead, it blew up in his face because it was a lie. It tarnished his career forever and cast a dark cloud of doubt and suspicion over all of his reporting. You may recall Brian Williams in 2015. He had apparently been exaggerating an anecdote about coming under fire in a U.S. Army helicopter during the Iraq War in 2003. Another reporter, a military reporter from Stars and Stripes, and turned out it was a lie. Never happened. And so he lost his job. He had to admit he hadn't been telling the truth. not only on his nightly news broadcast the previous week, but also over the years of public appearances and on talk shows, was a lie presented as the truth from people that we're supposed to be able to trust. Misreporting the news is a form of lying to change minds. Not that long ago, a couple years back, CNN agreed to settle a lawsuit with Covington Catholic student Nick Sandmann. Remember, he's the fellow who stood there when there was an Indian shouting into his face, who was a protester, who was an activist, and CNN reported Covington in a very negative way, as did some other stations. The amount of the settlement wasn't made public, but the lawsuit sought $800 million from CNN, also from the Washington Post, also from NBC Universal. The Washington Post suit sought $250 million. Okay, ultimately, Covington won. We don't know the amounts, though. So you start to deal with freedom of the press, and this has very much to do with the Ninth Commandment. Okay, the First Amendment says this. Okay, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Now, the press is specifically mentioned. Okay, because the presumption is that the press is people having the right to identify the problems with their own government. And so that you can say that there's no experiment that was more interesting than what we are now trying. And the idea that Jefferson writes about it, that he says we trust will end in establishing the fact that man may be governed by reason and truth. Okay, so notice Jefferson goes into this new republic and the whole idea of America saying this is an experiment to see if men can be ruled by reason and truth. So truth and getting truth in the form of government we have is very critical. When the people are involved in deciding what happens. Our first object should therefore be, he says, to leave open to him all the avenues to truth. The most effectual hitherto found is the freedom of the press. Hence, they included that in the first 10 amendments. It is, therefore, the first shut up by those who fear the investigation of their actions. By the way, I should mention Thomas Jefferson was in France when the Second Congressional Convention occurred. He was in France when the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, were put in place. But it represented his thinking as well as the committees. And then Benjamin Franklin said, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But freedom of speech is critical for a free country. Freedom of speech is dependent upon the truth generally being told in the press. But despots hate the truth that can come from a free press. Vladimir Lenin said, why should freedom of speech and freedom of press be allowed? Why should a government which is doing what it believes to be right allow itself to be criticized? It would not allow opposition by lethal weapons. Ideas are much more fatal things than guns. Why should any man be allowed to buy a printing press and disseminate pernicious opinions calculated to embarrass the government? Okay, so notice Lenin, who really was key to establishing the Marxist movement in Russia, and ultimately what spread to much of the world. Critical to him was there should not be freedom of the press. Napoleon Bonaparte said this, 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. Calvin Coolidge commented, wherever despotism abounds, the sources of public information are the first to be brought under its control. Wherever the cause of liberty is making its way, one of its highest accomplishments is the guarantee of the freedom of the press. In other words, freedom of the press is key to freedom generally. Labeling speech hate speech, which we've begun to do in our nation and elsewhere around the world, and far more so in Europe than here, squelches truth. The UN resolution that made criticism of Islam a crime has now become law in a variety of nations around the world. In England, well, actually, Scotland, you can even take, where a woman was arrested for praying silently near an abortion clinic because that was viewed as hate speech. But he wasn't even saying anything, but he was praying. I should be able, Kirk Cameron said, I should be able to express moral views on social issues without being slandered, accused of hate speech, and told from those who preach tolerance that I need to either bend my beliefs to their moral standards or be silent when I'm in the public square. Mark Potok said, one man's hate speech is another man's poetry, and that's because hate speech is in the ear of the beholder. Roosevelt and Orwell spoke about freedom of the press. Freedom of the press, Orwell said, remember he wrote the book 1984, if it means anything at all, it means the freedom to criticize and oppose. In other words, if you can't criticize and oppose, you don't have freedom. You have severe limits on what you can say. Franklin Roosevelt said the price of fake news, well, he didn't say that, I'm saying this, the price of fake news is a discredited press. And then here's his quote. There is a difference between freedom and license. Editorialists who tell downright lies in order to advance their own agendas do more to discredit the press than all the censors in the world. So let's get back to the purpose of the Ten Commandments, including the Ninth Commandment. It was intended to enable the Jews to build and maintain a nation. Exodus 15:26, you'll see it there on your screen. He said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all the decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. In other words, if you keep these commandments, you'll live. Joshua 1, we read this, you shall therefore keep every commandment I am giving you today, so that, for the purpose of, so that you may have the strength to go in and possess the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, and so that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give them and their descendants. But be careful that you are not enticed to turn aside to worship and bow down to other gods, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. He will shut the heavens so that there will be no rain, nor will the land yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is giving you. Elsewhere, he uses even stronger language, and he says, if you do not keep these commands, the land will vomit you out. In other words, it'll kick you out. So the Ten Commandments were given as a means to organize a society and live together peacefully and in harmony under the Lord's guidance. So truth, then, is vital for the functioning of any society. Leviticus 20. You are therefore to keep all my statutes and ordinances, so that the land where I am bringing you to live will not vomit you out. You must not follow the statutes of the nations I am driving out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. They were essentially vomited out. A little too graphic. Well, justice requires truth, but false testimonies destroy the truth. So there's an auto accident, and you talk to the witnesses. As you talk to the witnesses, you begin to piece together what happened. And you may get different pieces from each one. But you wind up, because it happened one time, you can't repeat it. You can't, maybe there were no cameras on it. Today, of course, there are cameras on virtually everything. So you talk to eyewitnesses. Now, epistemology, a long word, another $10, maybe even a $50 word, that means the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Corroboration is key. That's how you know. JFK was shot. For so many years, there was nobody on the grassy knoll. There was just a single shooter. It was not a conspiracy. It was only Lee Harvey Oswald. There was no connection between Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald and any part of the government and so on. And now, as all of the individual, as tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of papers have come out, what we know that after seeing things that are just declassified now, that's not true. What we knew was not so. Likewise with JFK, as with Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. People are generally rational, and I believe that they tend to make good decisions if you give them good facts. If you give them lies, it's like throwing a Molotov cocktail into a lunchroom. James says this in chapter 3 and verse 6. The tongue is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. He's talking about what a lie does. Okay, when you lie, you're setting things on fire. There's a conflagration that's being started. You may not even be aware of it, and you may not see it, but it happens. So how can you distinguish truth from fake news? Well, you go to the fact checkers, like Snopes.com. But who checks the fact checkers? So Snopes.com says this: Welcome to Snopes.com, the definitive internet reference source for urban legends, folklore, myths, rumors, and misinformation. Now, very interesting. Back in 2016, the Daily Mail did a detailed investigation of Snopes.com. And they wrote about this. It says it was announced last week that Snopes would be helping Facebook to determine and label fake news with the help of ABC News and PolitiFact. And that was according to the CEO of Snopes, David Mikkelsen. And Mickelson was embroiled at that time in a vicious legal battle with his former wife and his co-founder of Snopes, Barbara Mickelson. The couple divorced sometime around 2014, but legal proceedings continued on between the couple. Barbara Mickelson claims David embezzled $98,000 and he spent it on prostitutes. According to the Daily Mail, David has remained since his divorce from Barbara in 2014. I'm sorry, he's remarried. His current wife, Elisa Young, works as an administrative worker at Snopes, but she previously had a lengthy career as an escort and adult film star working under the name Erin O'Brien. Mickelson has previously stated that Snopes does not take any political positions whatsoever. His current wife, however, has a history of politics. The Daily Mail reports that Young ran for the U.S. Congress in Hawaii on the Libertarian ticket in 2004, during which time she distributed cards that read, "We defeat Bush," and condoms with a phrase on them, with a quote on them, printed on the wrapping. On her campaign website, Young outright stated, "Let's face it, I'm an unlikely candidate. I fully admit that I'm a courtesan." Young's campaign, however, was unsuccessful. She lost to Democratic incumbent Neil Abercrombie. Okay, so you start to see the character. These aren't necessarily people who are lovers of the truth. Speaking to the Daily Mail, David Mickelson stated that Snopes did not have a standardized procedure for fact-checking, since the nature of this material can vary widely. He also stated that the process involves multiple stages of editorial oversight, so no output is the result of a single person's discretion. When asked about the requirements for becoming an employee at Snopes, Mickelson stated, quote, "Accordingly, our editorial staff is drawn from diverse backgrounds. Some of them have degrees or professional experience in journalism, and some of them don't," unquote. Also, according to the Daily Mail, another one of Snopes' lead fact checkers has a history of sex blogging, writing under the pseudonym Vice Vixen. Okay, so if you've been going to Snopes, just understand the perspectives that they represent. And there are other fact checkers, and likewise, the problem is, how do you find an unbiased fact checker? So one of the things you need to do is find out what are their biases. Well, there's a biblical method of finding the truth, not fact checking. And now the scientific method is repeatability. Cold fusion couldn't be repeated, so it was therefore not true. In other words, you have to recreate the exact situation, but you can't do it with something that is historical, something that happened once in time. Well, the historical method is the testimony of two or more eyewitnesses establishes the truth. Matthew 18:16. But if he will not listen, Jesus says, take one or two others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. 1 Timothy 5:19, do not enter an accusation against an elder except on the testimony of two or three witnesses. Deuteronomy 19:15 lays this out. A lone witness is not sufficient to establish any wrongdoing or sin against a man, regardless of what offense he may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. Now, it's been popular in our day for people to say, oh, the charges are so severe, we have to investigate. Well, if it's coming from a single witness, how do you know if they're telling the truth or not? Numbers 35:30. If anyone kills a person, the murderer is to be put to death on the testimony of multiple witnesses. But no one is to be put to death based on the testimony of a lone witness. Okay, and so it's corroboration, and that used to be the norm. In the courts, it was the corroborating testimony, and that wasn't somebody who saw the person do something similar at another location or at another time or with another person, but rather it was at the same time multiple witnesses of a single event. Jesus knew about false witnesses. Now the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were seeking false testimony against Jesus in order to put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. They couldn't get the corroborating testimony. They couldn't get two to agree. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. At this, the high priest tore his clothes and he declared, he's blasphemed. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, he deserves to die. They arrived at the conclusion, even though they could not find corroborating witnesses. They sought facts only to justify their conclusion. People who seek power will distort the truth and promote lies. Okay, you can call it propaganda, fake news, spin, censorship, or even ridicule, comedy. But the goal is to promote lies. Socialism seeks to divide by sowing hatred with false news. Stories change minds. People remember stories. Pictures change minds. People remember pictures. Videos change minds. They combine basically the story and the picture. Nick Sandman and the students from Covington Catholic, by careful editing, NBC, CNN, and other stations were able to make him look as to be a very different person than he was. Well, they won a retraction from CNN. Well, you know what? Nobody reads the retractions. Sometimes the impact is so great, a war is lost. Back in the Vietnam War, there was the Tet Offensive. The reporting
model First Lady from their pages. The new Vanity Fair editor, Mark Caducci, reportedly interested in putting.
Okay, I missed some of that. My apologies. Sometimes the impact is so great that a war is lost. The Vietnam War, we were winning. The Tet Offensive, we won. But the reporting was that we had lost. And the reality was that we had a decisive victory. But ultimately, the fact that the news came out that we had lost led to the ultimate losing of that war. There's the big lie of National Socialism. You've heard the big lie. Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf wrote about it. In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility. They more readily fall victim to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies and little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. So they assume, in essence, what he's saying, that nobody would make up such a big lie. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, Hitler said, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation, the big lie. Goebbels, who worked for Hitler, said this about the big lie. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important to the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Lying to children in the classroom was necessary for communism to gain control. They needed to keep people from their own history. Karl Marx said you had to do that in order to control them, keep them from their own history, tear down their monuments, change their textbooks, take away a nation's heritage, he said, and they are more easily persuaded. And then he said this, the education of all children, from the moment that they can get along without a mother's care, shall be in state institutions. Who controls your children? Well, there's a battle going on today. Is it the parents or is it the teacher? Is it the parents? Is it the government? Is it the state? Vladimir Lenin spoke about control, all the truth. Give me your 4-year-olds, and in a generation I will build a socialist state. Give me just one generation of youth, and I will transform the whole world. The goal of socialism, he says, is communism. And remember, Karl Marx said socialism is just one step on the way to communism. The press should be not only a collective propagandist and a collective agitator. The press, that's what that said, that they should be a collective propagandist and a collective agitator, but they should also be a collective organizer of the masses. In other words, it's a tool. Journalism then becomes something very different. You set up a narrative. This is what you want to happen. This is what you want the people to believe. And then you fit the facts into the narrative, or you modify the facts to meet the narrative. We can and must write in a language which sows among the masses hate, revulsion, and scorn to those who disagree with us. Why should freedom of speech and freedom of press be allowed? Why should a government which is doing what it believes to be right allow itself to be criticized? It would not allow opposition by lethal weapons. Ideas are much more fatal things than guns. Why should any man be allowed to buy a printing press and disseminate pernicious opinions calculated to embarrass the government? And then he said, people always have been, and they always will be, stupid victims of deceit and self-deception in politics. Vladimir Lenin. Joseph Stalin. He used the press. The press must grow day in and day out. It is our party's sharpest and most powerful weapon. Okay, the press is a weapon. World dictatorship can be established only when the victory of socialism has been achieved in certain countries or groups of countries. Okay, so the press is absolutely key. Changing the press, changing the approach to truth in the press. Khrushchev said this, you Americans are so gullible. No, you won't accept communism outright, but we'll keep feeding you small doses of socialism until you finally wake up and find you already have communism. We won't have to fight you. We'll so weaken your economy until you'll fall like overripe fruit into our hands. I can prophesy that your grandchildren in America will live under socialism. Our firm conviction is that sooner or later, capitalism will give way to socialism. Whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will bury you. The United States will eventually fly the communist red flag. The American people will hoist it themselves. And how will this happen? The press is our chief ideological weapon. Now, of course, press today is social media. Press today is artificial intelligence. Press today is any number of different things that, videos and so on. Fidel Castro said this, socialism requires the silencing of the truth. The first thing dictators do is finish the free press to establish censorship. There is no doubt that a free press is the first enemy of dictatorship. Socialism requires lies to be accepted. We'll give you free college. Going to college and getting an education are not the same things, by the way. So people go to college, but you know what college used to be? I've shared with some of you in the past. I met a fellow years ago who used to come into our services, And he would sit there, tall guy in his 90s, and so surprisingly tall for somebody that age, and very upright, erect, great posture, probably about 6'2" or so. And he would read this purple bound Bible. And I recognized it was a copy of the Greek text of the Bible. It was, I think it was a Nestle text. Um, I was curious. He was following along with my message in the Greek Bible. So I met together with him and I found out that he had learned Greek and when he was a kid because he went to Princeton. He was in a class, it was either 1909 or 1912, and I don't remember. And unfortunately, he's no longer around for me to ask him. Um, and he just said, yeah, to be accepted into Princeton at that time, you had to be fluent in Greek and Latin, fluent in Greek and Latin. Um, and then you had to pass oral exams on history, on math, and a variety of other areas. Now, most people don't graduate from college with that kind of knowledge. Going to college used to be a quest for the truth. It's not that now. For most people, it's a ticket to some vocation. Um, College has been reduced substantially in terms of what it actually provides. It is not the same as getting an education. Some colleges are, but that's rare. That's more the exception. Free college, free health care. Do you remember this? You can keep your doctor. Well, it turns out you couldn't. Free housing. Well, would you like to move into public housing? That's tough for some people. In fact, it's tough for a lot of people. If free is not good enough, then how about this? A guaranteed monthly income. Who works when no one has to? That's the quote. The Pilgrims tried this and it failed miserably. They had to move away from a form of socialism to really a very rational form of capitalism. But there's no free lunch. Saving money doesn't guarantee performance. It is cheaper to send anything via the United States Post Office. But if you really want it delivered on time, people send it via FedEx or UPS. In fact, if you want it delivered at all in some cases. Or consider free health care in Canada. I met several people who, right at the time that Obamacare was getting passed here in the US, they were Canadians from one of our clients. We were speaking over lunch. And the one woman said proudly, yeah, we have free health care in Canada. I said, but the challenge is it's very hard to get. And she said, my son, who was in high school, I guess he was 16 years old at the time, had some type of a growth on his face that he wanted to get removed. Well, they got on a list for that to happen. And they were assigned a hospital, and they went to that hospital because they lived in a particular area, and there was one hospital they were permitted to go to. And they got on the list, and then they waited, and they waited. And finally, he was able to come up with some type of a private solution, even though that was forbidden. And he was able to have the growth cared for. And she said, yes, we actually just last week got the date for his surgery. And I asked her, I said, well, how long after your request was it? And she said, well, that was about 3.5 years. Okay, so free may mean that there are other limitations. This is from an article in the Las Vegas Review Journal, written by Barbara Delden. My husband and I visited our friends in Vancouver. Our conversation turned to Canada's free government-run healthcare. At the time of our visit, my friend was walking with a cane and on the wait list for a hip replacement. Our friends told us 50% of their income went to taxes to pay for their free healthcare. Did you catch that? 50% of their income went to taxes to pay for their free healthcare. We revisited them 2 years later. She was in a wheelchair, still waiting. Now, casuistry, this is a theological term. The Jesuits introduced it, and you know it better as the end justifies the means. A lie is a means to an end that is justified in the mind of the liar. It's a form of casuistry. The prophet of the U.S. socialist movement is a man named Saul Alinsky, long since dead, who's a socialist activist. He dedicated his most successful book, Rules for Radicals, to Satan, the first radical to win his kingdom. That's how he introduced it. The question is not, he said, do the ends justify the means? Rather, does this particular end justify this particular means? And then he continued on and said, truth is not a consideration. True revolutionaries, he said, do not flaunt their radicalism. They cut their hair, they put on suits and infiltrate the system from within. In other words, what he was saying was the protesters in the streets are never going to change anything. You have to be in the system to change the system. And then he said something interesting, and this was initially from Joseph Stalin. Control healthcare and you control the people because everyone is concerned about their health. And it becomes a life and death issue. The organizer's first job, he said, this is a community organizer. These were the agents of this movement. The organizer's first job is to create the issues of problems, and organizations must be based on many issues. So, in other words, the goal of a community organizer was to create many problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. So the community organizer is to create division. He must fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. Things that they were silent about, they need to be talking about now. He must search out controversy and issues rather than avoid them. For unless there is controversy, people are not concerned enough to act. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. His book, Rules for Radicals, is referred to as the Bible for community organizers. And it is from Saul Alinsky that we get the phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. Okay, the point being that the things that cause problems for people are the very things that can motivate them to action. And their actions can be guided when they are upset. And that's the goal of the community organizer. Create as many problems as possible so that you can emphasize those problems and then help people to see that your solution is the only reasonable solution. Now, some of the disciples of Saul Alinsky, Barack Obama, he worked for 3 organizations founded by Saul Alinsky. His first job, he worked for the Industrial Areas Foundation, teaching Alinsky's method. So he's very familiar with that. You'll see on the right-hand side there, one of the other things that Alinsky wrote, how to create a socialist society. The Industrial Areas Foundation is a Chicago-based community organizing network established in 1940 by Alinsky to, quote, build organizations whose primary purpose is power. Okay, so the primary purpose is not how do we help the people. The primary purpose is power, the ability to act, and whose chief product is social change. So power to create social change has nothing to do with what do the people want. 4 years as a community organizer and as director of the Developing Communities Project in Chicago. He taught the Alinsky method at Acorn. He was part of and a major leader in Project Acorn. This is the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. That's what Acorn stands for. And they did voter registration, subprime mortgages, and lobbied Congress. And Obama taught their leadership courses and served as their legal counsel. And then Project Vote, and he worked for them for 7 months. Hillary Clinton actually worked for Saul Alinsky, and she wrote her senior thesis on Saul Alinsky, and Alinsky wanted her to come to work for him. She did not. Alinsky was a Marxist, states it very clearly, who admired Lenin, and he sought to make America a Marxist socialist nation. He, in the first chapter of his book, begins by saying, Machiavelli's The Prince is written for the haves so that they are able to maintain power. My book is written for the have-nots so they can seize power. And he dedicated the book to Lucifer.